As we continue our studies of industrial society, we're now going to look to the workplace and work conditions, and how workers responded to these conditions and circumstances, as well as how society responded to rapid industrialization and wholesale capitalism. To do this, we're going to ask three central focus questions. What were common industrial work characteristics in this time of rapid industrial expansion? In what ways did workers respond to these workplace conditions and economic circumstances? And last, what were the societal reactions to the accumulation of immense sums of wealth for some and the desperate economic conditions of the many? There are several common characteristics as the industrial workplace emerged. You can characterize this by long hours, low pay, dangerous unsanitary environment, and a lack of protection for employees. This was hard, grueling labor, often in the steel mills or the coal mines, where people were working 12 to 16-hour days and being pushed to their max of ability. On top of that is that skilled workers would be fortunate to make $2 a day, so we can imagine what the pay for an unskilled laborer was. And throughout the 1870s, 80s, and 90s, there was a certain boom and bust quality to the economy. You have the panic of 1873, and then again recessions hitting in the mid 1880s, and then one again in 1893. And what this meant for businesses is that in their effort to expand, they were also at risk of contracting. So, at a moment's notice, hundreds of workers could be laid off. So, this provided for an unstable work environment, as in, there were not a lot of guarantees of your job longevity in a position. Another characteristic of the American industrial workplace is that it was simply dangerous. Working in a steel mill, you're at risk for serious injury or death, or on the railroads in a coal mine, or building an American skyscraper and eating your lunch hanging out above the entire city. This was difficult and dangerous work. Senator Henry Cabot Lodge described railroad workers. He said they suffer as if they were fighting in a war. And in 1889 is one significant year in injuries in the railroad industry alone, is 1 in 35 workers was hurt on the job, and 1 in 117 died on the job. Perhaps the most iconic event that highlights the conditions of the industrial workplace was the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire of 1911, where hundreds of Americans perished in this industrial accident. A fire broke out in this factory that was on the 7th floor, and all of a sudden, in just 18 minutes, hundreds of people lost their lives for a variety of reasons, whether it be the lack of protocols for fire exits, whether it was the doors that were locked from the outside by managers to prevent people from taking unnecessary breaks, or just some of the inabilities of the current technology to put out a fire at this height in this type of structure. But let's take a little moment to watch a video about the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory and think about the concepts that we have talked about, the dangers in the workplace, the potential risks and hazards, and how companies were solely in control of these conditions, as the government tended to take or had yet to become active in regulating business. And
the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire was a man-made disaster, a tragedy of the industrial age, made all the worse because it could have been prevented. Let me set the scene. New York City, early 20th century. The Triangle Shirtwaist Factory occupied several floors of a Manhattan business building called the Ash Building. It was located just off Washington Square Park, one of the wealthiest neighborhoods in the city. The Triangle Shirtwaist Factory was, by almost any definition, a sweatshop. It was a densely packed place. Some 500 people worked there, and the work schedule was punishing. 11 to 12 hours a day, every day. Most of the people employed at the factory were young immigrant women, teenagers even, who didn't speak English. These women sat at long tables, day in, day out, sewing shirtwaists. Shirtwaists were mass-produced blouses. They resembled men's shirts and were very popular with working women. So here's what happened. March 25th, 1911, Saturday evening, the end of the workday, the work week. A fire started in a bin of cotton scraps, perhaps from a cigarette butt. A manager tried to use a hose to put it out, but the hose valve was rusted shut, and the hose itself was rotted away. The factory floor didn't have a sprinkler system, so the fire spread quickly. People panicked. The building had only one flimsy fire escape, and it wasn't nearly big enough. It collapsed. The building had 4 elevators, but only one was working, and it only held 12 people at a time. It managed to make 4 rescue trips before it broke down. Some desperate workers jumped to their deaths down the elevator shaft. Workers tried to take the stairs, but the exit doors only opened inward, and they were kept locked by factory management. Many people were crushed to death trying to get out. Firefighting technology hadn't caught up to the new tall buildings of a city like New York. The fire hoses and ladders could only reach the 7th floor, 1 floor short of the fire. Dozens of desperate workers jumped out of the windows. They chose to die from the fall instead of the flames. Other workers burned to death or died from smoke inhalation. The whole episode lasted just 18 minutes. 144 people were dead. 2 more died later in the hospital, bringing the death toll to 146. Until the events of September 11th, it was the deadliest workplace disaster in New York City history. Days later, on April 5th, a massive funeral protest march took place on 5th Avenue in Manhattan. More than 350,000 people were in attendance. The factory owners, Max Planck and Isaac Harris, were indicted for manslaughter, but were declared not guilty in their trial later that year. Yet, long after the flames died out, the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire served as a cautionary tale that helped to redefine the American industrial workplace. The fire was a key moment in the growth of labor unions, particularly the ILGWU, or International Ladies Garment Workers Union. New York City passed measures including the Sullivan-Hoey Fire Prevention Law, which required sprinkler systems to be installed in all factories. It served as a model for state and national workplace safety codes. These measures made American workers safer, but they were too late for the workers who perished one terrible March day at the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory.
Final characteristic of the industrial workplace that I'd like for you to think about is the lack of rights and protections specifically for employees. So we discussed some of the dangers when it comes to the workplace, but what if you were to become seriously maimed or injured on the job and then you no longer could work? Today we have these kind of safe nets put in, unemployment, workman's compensation, but during the emergence of industrialization, these concepts have yet to become popularized or even just become significant in American society. So if you were hurt on the job or died on the job, your family has to figure out how to continue on and continue to subsist without that income. You could also see this as from another angle, not just of those inherent risks because of the lack of these institutions or social safety nets that we have developed over time, but also this specific abuse when it comes to the employee employer relationship. For instance, yellow dog contracts forbade employees from joining unions, and from a state that is a right to work state in North Carolina that just hasn't had a history of unions in there, you can see how businesses would be naturally adverse to collective bargaining and the formation of unions. So these stipulations put in place by employers to protect them from labor demands were one component. Blacklisting was another aspect, is that one manager described or said that his style of management was anytime an employee picked his head up to hit it. And what he meant by this was that the employee's job is to keep their head down, do their work, and that's it. But if they are to pick their head up and challenge workplace conditions, challenge pay, challenge hours, um, or challenge the management structure, that he would hit it. And that is what the concept of blacklisting was, is that if you were to step out of line when it came to challenging these conditions and these circumstances, that a lot of times employers actively work to prevent you not only from firing you, they would fire you from employment there, but actively work to prevent you from getting another job by colluding with other employers. On top of that, you can see other aspects of the abuse or lack of protections for workers when it came to child labor. Children actively were participants in the labor market and willingly in so many cases. Parents often lied about children's ages in hopes of getting an additional income, or as they're struggling to meet their weekly and monthly or daily economic obligations. People contributed from the very beginning. In fact, Andrew Carnegie, who would later become the titan of industry, began working 11-hour days when he was 11 years old. So, child labor, as this potentially also led to abuse, and not like as in, well, and also in a lot of different areas. And for instance, children, often while they were treated as employees, were still kids on the job. And there were stories of kids in factories playing games and that were physically dangerous. And then also you have other aspects and conditions of should there be minimum wages in society? How should convict labor be used and integrated in society? So to recap, those four characteristics of long hours, long difficult work hours, low pay, that very uncertain work environment, dangerous conditions in the workplace that led to injury or long-term health ramifications, and the lack of rights and protections for employees had yet to become popularized in American culture.